The Netflix series Cleopatra has stirred up much controversy, with many upset about the choice of the leading actress and many accusations of blackwashing. The amount of vitriol directed towards the series and personal attacks on lead actress Adelle James is unprecedented. But what are the facts, and why are people so unhinged? Are African Americans trying to steal Egyptian culture, or are they raising concerns of larger historical inaccuracies that need to be corrected? Do these grievances from modern Egyptians represent the entire country, or are there dissenting Egyptian voices that challenge the prevailing belief that ancient Egypt was a Mediterranean civilization? Let us take a closer look at the story of Cleopatra and the events that led up to her reign. While Cleopatra is a title which has been held by many women in the past, the Cleopatra in question is Cleopatra VII Thyself. She was born in 69 BCE in Greco-Roman Egypt at a time when indigenous Africans had lost rulership over the once great nation of Kemet. Egypt was merely a shadow of Kemet's former glory, as centuries of invasions and foreign occupation caused its decline. Egypt is a derivative of the Greek word Egyptos, as are most of the words and names associated with this ancient African civilization. The indigenous African name was Kemet, which translates to the Black Land or the Land of the Blacks. It was also known as Semitoe, the union of the two lands, and Tamari, the beloved land. Cleopatra ruled from the Delta, as was traditional of all foreign rulers, including the Hyksos, Libyans, Assyrians, Persians, Mamluks, French, British, and finally the Arab Republic of Egypt, whose capital currently resides in Lower Egypt, in the city of Cairo. Historically, indigenous Nwesets, mistakenly labeled as pharaohs, ruled from Upper Kemet, 1,000 kilometers away from the Delta, deep in the southernmost regions of the nation. The most prominent capital of indigenous rulers was the city of Waset, known to the Greeks as Thebes and modern Egyptians as Luxor. Cleopatra VII was part of the Ptolemaic dynasty. In 332 BC, the Macedonian general Alexander the Great defeated the Persian Empire and took control of Kemet. The Ptolemies adopted Kemetic customs and incorporated their pre-existing administrative practices. Their goal was to rule as pharaohs rather than foreigners, as did the Persians. But as you will soon find out, they were never accepted by the natives of the nation of Kemet. It has been suggested that the Ptolemies only married within their family to keep the bloodline pure, so therefore she could not have had African blood. This, however, is a fallacy. The Ptolemies did indeed marry and have children outside of their own family lineage. The mother of Ptolemy, the 12th, was believed to be an unknown woman who worked in one of the many harems. It was also speculated by German ancient historian Werner Huss that Ptolemy's the 12th's mother was an unknown woman belonging to the Egyptian elite. Greeks bearing children by native Africans elite, even courtesans, was a common occurrence over their 300-year reign. According to Susan Walker, deputy keeper in the Department of Greek and Roman Antiquities at the British Museum, early Ptolemaic Greek colonists married local women and adopted Egyptian religious beliefs, and by Roman times, their descendants were viewed as Egyptians by the Roman rulers despite their own self-perception of being Greek. As Victor J. Katz notes,
research in papyri dating from the early centuries of the Greco-Roman era demonstrates that a significant amount of intermarriage took place between the Greek and Egyptian communities.
But who were these native Egyptians they speak of?
But the CT scan has one more surprise for Alejandro: Shammai's ethnicity.
Well, they have just told me that Shammai had Nubian features, which means that their ruling family was probably Nubian, and that was unexpected.
Examining Shammai's anatomy closely, the thickness of his bones and the shape of his nasal cavity, the anthropologists think he was a black African, likely from neighboring Nubia. A huge revelation that challenges the prevailing image of the Egyptian ruling class.
We always thought the ancient Egyptian elite were Mediterranean type. And in this sense, Shema is representing the society of the frontier in which different ethnic groups were mixed. At the end, it doesn't matter the color of your skin. Shema was Egyptian.
Kemet had a profound influence on the development of Hellenistic civilization and the Mediterranean world as a whole. The Greeks were educated by ancient Africans and worshipped the Neteru, which were personified conscious forces of nature which Europeans would mistakenly label as gods. Amun, worshipped by the Greeks as Ammon, had a statue built in his honor in the city of Thebes and another in Sparta. At Megalopolis, the god was represented with the head of a ram, and the Greeks of Cyrenaica dedicated a chariot with a statue of Ammon at the Temple of Delphi. The Hellenes fused many Kemetic and Greek gods, such as Zeus, Amun, and even deified historical Kemetic figures, such as Imhotep, the world's first multi-genius whom the Greeks worshipped as Asclepius. Greece's most famous philosophers studied in Kemet in the ancient mystery schools indigenously, known as the Per-Ankh, or the House of Life. It's important to note that such institutions were unknown to the Greeks prior to their contact with ancient Africans. Plato studied in Kemet for 13 years. Pythagoras studied philosophy, geometry, and medicine for 22 years. Thales, who was the first Greek to be accepted in the mystery schools, studied for 7 years, while Hippocrates, who was considered the father of medicine, recognized the multi-genius Imhotep as the father of medicine and deified him as previously mentioned. The Pythagorean theorem was used to build the pyramids in Kemet thousands of years before Pythagoras was born. Plato said Egyptian education makes students more alert and human. Plato also told his students to go to Egypt if they wanted to study the mind of great philosophers. Herodotus, the Greek historian who referred to the continent of Africa as Ethiopia, acknowledged the mystical land as the cradle of civilization. In those times, Greeks referred to sub-Saharan Africa as Upper Ethiopia, and the Sahara was known as Lower Ethiopia. The Atlantic Ocean was called Oceanus Aethiopicus, Latin for Ethiopian Ocean, and would not become the Atlantic until the 1600s. The name Ethiopia is a compound derived of two Greek words, which translates to burnt face, referring to the dark melanated complexion of the ancient Egyptians and Nubians, indigenously known as Tamurians and Tasaians. The term was also used as a generic term for black Africans. Memnon, the king of Ethiopia, brought an army to Troy's defense during the fierce battle in Homer's epic, the Iliad. He was known for his valor in battle and managed to best the great Achilles before a glorious and honorable death. The Queen of Sheba, renowned for her cleverness and wisdom, whose egalitarian interaction with the wise King Solomon was a legendary meeting of the minds. But why is any of this important? It illustrates the pivotal role Africans played in antiquity and the influence they exerted not only in Egypt, but also in the Levant and the Mediterranean world. In antiquity, prior to the colonial era, ancient Ethiopians were renowned throughout the known world for their wisdom and regal qualities. Ancient Africa was a mystical land at the edge of the world where many legends came out of and were integrated into Greek and Roman lore, as well as some of the world's earliest technological advancements in the fields of astronomy, metallurgy, philosophy, and spiritual evolution. But starting in the 16th and 17th centuries, a narrative began to be spun which served to demonize the continent in order to justify its subjugation. Colonialism was successful not only in colonizing Africa, but also propagating the trope of the Dark Continent, a fallacy which did not exist in the ancient world. In Histories, which is considered the founding work of history in Western literature and dates to 440 BC, Herodotus presents some of the most ancient and detailed information about Ethiopia. He relates that he personally traveled up the Nile to the border of Egypt as far as Elephantine, which is modern-day Aswan. He describes a capital further south at the kingdom of Meroe, adding that the only deities worshipped there were Amun, known as Zeus to the Greeks, and Asar, known as Dionysus. He relates that in the reign of Pharaoh Psamtik, the first in 650 BC, many Egyptian soldiers deserted their country and settled amidst the Ethiopians. War with the Persians resulted in the end of Kushite power in northern Egypt and the successful invasion by the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They were succeeded by the 26th dynasty, initially a puppet dynasty installed as vassals of the Assyrians. This exodus of natives migrating south coincides with the defeat of the great Kushite kings as indigenous Kemites fled further south to escape the wrath of the invading Assyrian army and assimilate into the kingdom of Kush. Herodotus also remarked on the shared cultural practices between Egyptians and Ethiopians, as he states,
I myself guessed it to be so, partly because they are dark-skinned and woolly-haired. Though that indeed goes for nothing, seeing that other peoples, too, are such. But my better proof was that the Colchians and Egyptians and Ethiopians are the only nations that have from the first practiced circumcision.
Herodotus's accounts illustrate the similarities between native Egyptians and Nubians and their shared cultural heritage. It also serves to debunk the ridiculous claim by some that state ancient Egyptians were not black Africans, despite the mountain of evidence and primary sources, which prove the ancient Kemites were indeed true Africans.
Egyptians are black. The real Egyptians are black, because the real Egyptians, they are real Africans. So those people in Lower Egypt, you see, in Cairo, Alexandria, and the Falahins area, they were mixed between the Turkish, Mamluks, French, English, Romans. So those people who come to attack Egypt in that time, they couldn't come to Upper Egypt, to the south, which we still had the same color, our dark color or black color. So they couldn't mix with us. The Nubians and the Egyptians, they were not white. They are black Africans.
The views of Muhammad Arabi goes to show not all modern Egyptians are conditioned to buy into anti-African rhetoric. The Arab Republic of Egypt's official views may classify the ancient civilization as Mediterranean, but the historical evidence suggests a purely African origin. Now that we have a little bit of background information of the relationship between Greece and Kemet, let's get back to Cleopatra. When referring to the Fayum portraits of Greco-Roman Egypt, it is clear that many of the portraits depict people of mixed ancestry. We have already established that from their very beginning the Macedonians were of mixed heritage, and southern Greece had admixture from the Near East. Given the fact that the already mixed Macedonians lived in Africa for 3 centuries and adopted ancient African culture, it would be naive to think they did not intermix with native Africans. It is not at all a stretch of imagination that they intermarried and intermixed with native Africans, producing offspring of mixed heritage. This is apparent even in the phenotype of many modern Egyptians today in Cairo and Alexandria who have African features, such as dark complexions and coarse hair. So while no one can be 100% sure of the ethnic makeup of Cleopatra VII, we know for sure she was of mixed heritage. Seems many are starkly opposed to this idea, not out of lack of evidence, but rather anti-African rhetoric. This very real possibility has sent some into a frenzy, despite evidence that suggests, yes, she may have indeed come from a mixed African lineage. The mixed actress of African and European descent, Adelle James surely more closely resembles Cleopatra than the lily-white British-American actress Elizabeth Taylor or the French actress Claudette Colbert. And surely Adele Smith's portrayal of the famous queen as powerful and politically savvy did her far more justice than the English actress Lindsay Marshall's portrayal of Cleopatra in the HBO series Rome as a sleazy, opium-addicted mockery of a queen. So why was there no uproar about Northern Europeans playing Cleopatra? The hypocrisy is glaringly obvious and the backlash is blown way out of proportion. But is there any other evidence to suggest mixed African ancestry? Under Greco-Roman rule, Egypt hosted several Greek settlements, mostly concentrated in Alexandria, but also in a few other cities where Greek settlers lived alongside native Egyptians. Fayum's earliest Greek inhabitants were soldier veterans and elite military officials who were settled by the Ptolemaic kings on colonized lands. Native Egyptians also lived in the region of Fayum. It is estimated that as much as 30% of the population of Fayum was Greek during the Ptolemaic period, with the rest being native Egyptians. By the Roman period, much of the Greek population of Fayum was made up of either Hellenized Egyptians or people of mixed Egyptian-Greek ancestry. The Delta was a transcontinental highway connecting 3 continents. A good portion of the population would have been of mixed ancestry, some of whom would have resembled the mixed actress Adelle James. In this 14th century manuscript, Cleopatra and the Ptolemies were depicted as having African or mixed descent. A testament to how she was viewed in medieval times and further evidence of possible African admixture. Due to this evidence, it is not at all a stretch of the imagination that Cleopatra may have been mixed with African blood, and furthermore, the appearance of the people of Greco-Roman Egypt, based on the Fayum portraits, illustrate a population whom look very similar in features, complexion, and hair texture as Adelle James. Considering the fact they were on the continent of Africa, it would actually be preposterous to assume that these various populations of Africans, Greeks, and Asiatics did not mix and intermarry. Especially since the racism and colorism of colonial Europe had not been introduced to the world yet. The outrage and anti-African sentiment being expressed due to this controversy has been blown way out of proportion, and hypocrisy is blatantly obvious. Many people mixed with African ancestry have passed as full Europeans in the past and present. This was extremely common in the U.S. due to racism. Many passed as white as a means to escape the racial caste system, which placed blackness at the bottom and whiteness at the top. Similar to the racial hierarchies created by modern Egyptian elites in Cairo and Alexandria.
You did point out that Egyptian guidebooks that were popular had some very racist descriptions about the attitude of Egyptians toward different racial groups.
Yes, you'll see even in current guidebooks probably a kind of a hierarchical description of the views of the races, yes.
So many Egyptians today who probably think of themselves primarily as Mediterranean people, even though they're on the African continent, look down at the idea that a very powerful ancient culture might have emerged out of Black Africa.
Yeah, and it's clearly, obviously, a modern ethnic view or ethnic mindset that leads to that kind of thinking. Not any evidence from ancient history, I don't think.
في ابتدائي كانوا مثلا لما يميزوني البت التخينة السوداء. في اعدادي اعتقد انا كان نفسي البس تي شيرت احمر. في حد قال مثل كده كنت اول مرة اسمعه في حياتي، عايز تضحك على الاسمر لبسه احمر. وانا في تانية ثانوي في حد كان طلع عليا تهاني ضلمه، وانا ساعتها غضبت قوي. كان في ساعتها كريمات طالعه اللي هي بتاعه التفتيح، وبعدين لقيت بنات الافتح مني بيستخدموها وبداوا يتكلموا معايا ما تحطي الحاجات دي في وشك. بعد اقتنع واشوف ان دي مقاييس الجمال. يعني بعد ما خلصت الجامعه 25 سنه 26 سنه، بعد ما خلصت الجامعه ما كانش عندي اي ثقه في نفسي في شكلي تماما. بدأت أحس إن أقل من اللي موجودين، إن أنا طبع أقل، شكل أقل. من 10 سنين تقريبا رحت الدكتورة، اكتشفت إن أنا كنت بعيط بسبب الكلام المؤذي ده. كانت في كده موضة كانت بتاعت أغاني الهيب هوب والراب، وكان ساعتها لسه بقى بيانسي ولسه ميسي إليوت، كل دول كانوا بدأوا شوية هنا في مصر يعرفوهم. بدأت صورة الجمال تتغير، فبدأوا يعني يتقبلوا إنه إيه دول حلوين، فشويتين بدأوا يشوفوا إن في مصر شبه دول. نفسي يبقى في التلفزيون والافلام ما بتقللش، ما يبقوش جايبين واحده سمراء او سوداء سواء مصريه او غير مصريه ابقى بتريق عليها، ابقى جايبها مثال للقبح، مثال اللي هي شخص اقل، ما فيش لون احسن من لون. فالناس لازم تفهم ده.
Considering the proliferation of racist anti-African propaganda in Egypt, their attempt to suppress the image of blackness in ancient Egypt and its origins with black Africans comes to no surprise.
You shouldn't be selling Egyptian culture if you're not Egyptian and don't tell other Africans to our stuff. طب ومين قال لك ان انا مش مصرية؟ ولا عشان انا سودة يبقى ما ينفعش اكون مصرية؟ على فكرة انا اصلي فرعوني، احنا اللي بنينا البلد. وانت فاكر مصر فين؟ في اوروبا؟ What's other Africans؟ العنصرية اللي فيك تكسف. روح اتعلم شوية وبطل جهل.
Seemingly white depictions of Cleopatra, the seventh does not exclude her from having mixed African heritage. She could have had white skin and blonde hair and still have mixed African ancestry. Based on archaeological evidence and cranial measurements that suggest the mother of Cleopatra's sister was African, we can also theorize it is possible that Cleopatra as well had some African ancestry. Arsinoe is said to have opposed Cleopatra's rule, which led to her untimely death. Interestingly enough, according to Hilke Thur of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, upon examination it was found that Arsinoe was of mixed heritage, both Greek and African. Although DNA tests came back inconclusive due to deterioration, the cranial measurements of the mother of Arsinoe revealed the skull of an African woman. This discovery lends credence to the assertion of the BBC News, who stated,
Cleopatra, the last Egyptian pharaoh, renowned for her beauty, was part African, says a BBC team which believes it has found her sister's tomb. Queen Cleopatra was a descendant of Ptolemy, the Macedonian general who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great. But remains of the queen's sister Princess Arsinoe, found in Ephesus, Turkey, indicate that her mother had an African skeleton. Experts have described the results as a real sensation.
The distance from the forehead to the back of the skull is long in relation to the overall height of the cranium, and that's something that you see quite frequently in certain populations, one of which is ancient Egyptians. Another would be black African groups will also show that characteristic. This one certainly looks more white European, but it has got this long head shape. It could suggest a mixture of ancestry.
The Macedonians were an ancient tribe whose origins began on the alluvial plains around the rivers Haliakmon and Lower Axios in the northeastern part of mainland Greece. Cleopatra, the first who was a princess of the Seleucid Empire in West Asia, was of Greek, Persian, and Iranian descent. Her mother, Latice, the third, was Iranian and Persian, while her father, Antiochus, also had mixed Iranian ancestry. Southern Greece and Italy was a mixing pot of ethnic variation from its birth. According to historian Spencer McDaniel,
most people assume that everyone who lived in ancient Greece and Rome were white. This is a notion that has been continually reinforced through modern films and television shows. We can be quite certain that Greeks and Italians have been in contact with dark-skinned peoples of African and Near Eastern ancestry from the very beginning of their history, from a time even before the development of the Greek alphabet. These people certainly included famous philosophers, writers, theologians, and even Roman emperors. In fact, people whom we would consider people of color probably made up a significant proportion of the total population of the Roman Empire, if not the majority.
Given the fact that the already mixed Macedonians lived in Africa for over 3 centuries and adopted Kemetic culture, it would be naive to think they did not intermix with native Africans. But who were these ancient Africans who established dynastic Egypt? Let us give a brief history of the origins of ancient Kemetic culture, science, and tradition.
UNESCO's General History of Africa studies show that the earliest people in the Nile Valley were from an early human population in East Africa who moved north. Though some scholars still believe the Egyptians were right from the beginning made up of people from different regions of Africa who then mixed with migrants originally from Western Asia. I wonder how the Egyptians might identify themselves today. Well, to get an idea of this, I go to southern Egypt, where most of the country's historic monuments are situated. I drop by to meet the Suleiman family in the village of Al-Aqab, just outside Aswan.
بتفتكروا يعني هي حضارة إفريقية ولا شيء غير إفريقي؟
أفريقية. حضارة أفريقية.
My local guide in Aswan is Fatima Mohammed Subhi. She studied Egyptology, and I ask her if she believes the ancient Egyptians were black.
I believe, yes, they were not white, but black because they always painted in dark red, not white at all. So this is a color which we have, different colors of black.
Was it an African civilization?
I believe, of course, the southern, the kings comes from the south. They were more similar, or looks like me and you. If you go more southern, you are more darker, so it's more African.
Narmer, accompanied by his army and courtiers, came from the south near the region of modern-day Aswan, a region whose indigenous population are black Africans even to this day. Narmer donned the hedjet, the white crown of Upper Kemet. He conquered the Levantine population occupying the delta at the time and established his rulership over the two lands. Narmer's palette, which is considered to be the first historical document in the world, depicts Narmer and his allies from the south defeating his foes, followed by a ceremonial procession in which he is now donning the deshret, the red crown of Lower Egypt. At the bottom of the palette, the corpse of Narmer's enemy lay trampled to death by a bull, which represents the king's power and vitality. The corpse is depicted with straight hair and a long alkaline nose, which are phenotypes attributed to Asiatics or Indo-Europeans, while Narmer and his allies are depicted with round snub noses and woolly afros. Both allies have African features and hair textures. Upper Kemet historically was the seat of its political power. Pharaonic kingship developed in Lower Sudan and Upper Egypt, in and around the regions of Kustal, Elephantine, and Waset. Ancient astronomy was developed at the site of the Naphtha-Pleiistone Circle in Sudan, which dates back to 5000 BC.
The Naphtha-Pleia find was announced by CNN as the Stonehenge of the Sahara.
Do we know anything at all about the people who created these structures?
Yes, we know they were black African people. Their remains are studied anthropologically, and they were the people inhabiting the region of the time.
It is the world's oldest astronomical device and was used to study the precession of the equinox for several millennia. The art of mummification was developed in ancient Libya, with the 5,600-year-old black mummy of the Green Sahara being the earliest evidence of ritualistic mummification in the world. These regions are also where we find the earliest evidence of the cattle cults and the worship of Het Heru, also known as Hathor, the Lady of Punt.
I find it very interesting that these animal-headed human figures exist outside of Egypt at such an incredibly early date. And then later in pharaonic culture, you find exactly the same motifs repeated in the very sophisticated Egyptian art form.
Around 3400 BC, due to extreme weather events and the desertification of the Sahara, these populations migrated into the Nile Valley and brought with them their culture and high science.
At about 3500 BC, the monsoon rains pattern moved further south. So Naphtha-Pleia region became extreme desert and had to be abandoned. And that's when the culture, the ancient Egyptian dynastic culture that shows many of the same elements pops up in the Nile Valley. So there are many elements, clearly, of the culture that was operating at Naphtha-Pleia in the earlier time that moved to the Nile Valley and became the ancient Egyptian dynastic civilization.
Why is this important? Because it shows the cultures of the Green Sahara, Nilotic, and Northeast Africa all shared common culture and tradition dating as far back as the Younger Dryas era.
So we have just here Tripoli, we have here Cairo and the Nile, and just in the center we have the Caucasus Mountains. And we have Algeria, Libya, Egypt and Sudan and Chad and Niger and Mali. So this area is bigger than Europe, so it means that all this very, very large extent was inhabited during ancient times by the same ancient African Saharan culture.
I find it quite extraordinary that this Central Saharan civilization shows all the features we generally associate with later Egyptian pharaonic culture, and mummification is a prime example. There are definite links between the two cultures.
It was the civilizations of Kemet, Kush, and Punt which comprised the most influential and well-documented populations of Nile Valley civilization. Upper Egyptians in the regions where pharaonic kingship developed identify as Black Africans and are the true ancestors of the original pharaonic dynasties. Images of native Egyptians from the early 19th century illustrate the dark complexion and African textured hair that are depicted in ancient Kemetic artwork and who Herodotus described as Ethiopians. These original kings and queens of the Old and Middle Kingdoms have been hidden away from the mainstream because of their clear African features. Instead, fair-skinned Mediterranean types have been deceitfully promoted in museums and media to portray ancient Kemet as a Mediterranean civilization, somehow foreign and disconnected from the rest of Africa. This, however, is a misconception, as the evolution of the various Nile Valley populations are intertwined and their interactions and cultural identities were fluid. Despite their relatively low status, fair-skinned statues are highlighted while statues of phenotypic African pharaohs are obscured, most of which have had their noses desecrated in an attempt to conceal their ethnicity.
We don't have Egyptians of European descent in Egypt. We have a population which is basically a mixture of ancient Egyptian blacks who intermarried with Arabs right after the Arab conquest. The ancient Egyptian population was brown and black before the Arab conquest. But before the Arab conquest came the Greeks. It was the ancient Egyptian population was in Egypt for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptian population was brown and black. And the Greeks came in 300 BC, and they started to intermarry with the local population. And then the Romans came and ruled from 70 BC until they were conquered by the Arabs and kicked out by the Arabs in the 7th century. And these people intermarried with the Egyptian Copts, and they made the pigmentation of the Egyptians, the Copts, much lighter because of this intermarriage with Europeans.
Scientific racism and racist theories, such as the Hamitic theory, are still pervasive to this day. A testament to the colonial legacy of 19th century Egyptologists such as George Reisner and James Breasted. With that being said, seeing Black Africans represented in history as more than slaves is a good look, but let us not be disillusioned by this act. Although a step in the right direction, this does not do much to correct the racist legacy of Egyptology, which served to disconnect ancient Egypt from the rest of Africa. Kemet, under the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty, was nothing less than foreign occupation. Native Africans were faced with second-class citizenship, and in the Greek provinces of Lower Kemet, in the Delta, indigenous Africans were forced to pay higher taxes than their Greek counterparts. Greek rulers ginned up much propaganda in attempts to be accepted as true pharaohs, but the indigenous Kemet EU never fully accepted their rule. The Ptolemies remained fundamentally a foreign dynasty. Starting from 246 BC, there are several native uprisings. During the most successful of these, all of Upper Egypt revolted against Alexandria for almost 20 years under the leadership of two native rulers named Horwenfer and Enkwenfer. They led Upper Egypt in secession from the rule of Ptolemy IV, Philopator in 205 BC. In 196 BC, the Greeks launched a counteroffensive and retook Lycopolis, modern-day Asiut in the Delta. Afterwards, Ptolemy was officially crowned pharaoh in Memphis. Enkwenfer retreated to the border of Kush and called upon the Kushite kings for help against the invaders. The Kushites' aid to Egypt against foreign invasion is reminiscent of the 25th dynasty's role in expelling Libyan invaders 2 centuries earlier. These particular rebellions were known as the Great Revolt of the Egyptians and was one of the earliest documented guerrilla wars. The Kemite and Kushite coalition continued to resist the Greek usurpers up until 186 BC, when Enquenfer's Egyptian-Nubian army was decisively defeated. In the following months, the Ptolemaic army wiped out the remaining rebels in the Delta. Due to Ptolemy X's attempts to erase these rebellions from history, little is known about these historical events as most of the records were destroyed. The Rosetta Stone, dated 196 BC, is contemporary with the Great Revolt. It is an honorary decree in the Greek tradition, dressed up by the Egyptian priests for King Ptolemy, the 10th after his victory of another native revolt in the Delta. Although the Ptolemies adopted Kemetic culture and depicted themselves as native rulers, the indigenous Kemet revolted and rejected their rulership. Still, Greek rule ended up being the final invasion of a long line of invasions that would extinguish the final light of the once great civilization of Kemet. Until we have a Netflix documentary about Queen Amenorines, who defeated the Roman Empire at their height, or one of Amenhotep and Queen Tiye, who ruled over a peaceful and prosperous nation, the true history of Nile Valley civilization will remain obscured from the masses. In conclusion, regardless of Cleopatra's racial makeup, she did not represent the culture of ancient Kemet and did not uphold the principles of Ma'at, which the nation was built upon. So, was Cleopatra an African queen protecting her country, as Jada Pinkett's documentary would have us believe? Or was she an accomplice to a foreign occupation which lasted 3 centuries and ultimately led to the downfall of the greatest civilization in antiquity? This matter is up for debate, similar to historians' different interpretations of the reign of Akhenaten during the Amarna period. But one thing's for sure, there's definitely many more stories to be uncovered and more historical lies and hypocrisies to be revealed. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out our docuseries entitled Know Thyself for more content on Nile Valley culture. Log in with us. www.knowthyselfinstitute.com. Support the channel by tapping that like, subscribe, and notify button to be alerted to new content. Education is king. Knowledge of self is omnipotent. Know thyself.